The Moon Landing Hoax, Cold War Pressure, Missing Tapes and Visual Anomalies. July 20th, 1969. A grainy black and white image flickers across television screens around the world. The signal is unstable. The audio crackles. A figure descends a ladder in slow, deliberate motion. Then a sentence that would echo for generations. That's one small step for man. In living rooms, bars, military bases, and crowded city streets, hundreds of millions watch in silence. It is described as the greatest technological achievement in human history. A species leaving its planet. A boundary crossed. A moment that appears to settle a geopolitical rivalry in a single step. And yet, almost as soon as the applause fades, a quieter question begins to circulate. What if it never happened the way we were told? The moon landing stands as both a milestone and a mystery in the public imagination. It is one of the most documented events of the 20th century, supported by thousands of hours of technical data, physical samples, and institutional reports. And still, more than 5 decades later, doubt persists in pockets of the public. Not loud enough to rewrite history, but persistent enough to refuse disappearance. This documentary explores that tension. It examines the historical conditions, the official narrative, the emergence of skepticism, and the cultural forces that shaped belief and disbelief alike. The theories discussed are part of public discourse and speculation. They are presented here for examination, not endorsement. To understand how doubt became possible, the world of 1969 must be reconstructed first. The Apollo 11 mission did not emerge in isolation. It was the culmination of a decade defined by existential competition. After World War II, 2 superpowers stood facing one another across ideological lines. The United States and the Soviet Union possessed nuclear arsenals capable of annihilation. Their conflict rarely erupted into direct warfare, but it shaped global politics in nearly every region. This was the Cold War. A battle of systems, symbols, and perception. Technology became proof of superiority. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It was small, metallic, and simple by modern standards. But its signal, a steady beep transmitted from space, carried a psychological weight far beyond its size. The United States had been beaten into orbit. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space. Again, the Soviets reached a milestone first. The perception began to solidify. Perhaps the Soviet system was technologically superior. That same year, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress with a bold commitment. The United States, he declared, would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It was not framed as curiosity, it was framed as necessity. The moon became a geopolitical target. Throughout the 1960s, NASA expanded rapidly. Budgets surged. Engineers, scientists, mathematicians, and contractors numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Massive facilities rose across the United States. The Saturn V rocket, still one of the most powerful machines ever built, was developed to carry humans beyond Earth's orbit. But the race to the moon unfolded against a backdrop of domestic instability. The Vietnam War escalated, drawing public protest. The civil rights movement reshaped national conversations about justice and identity. The assassinations of President Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. shook public confidence. Trust in institutions, while still strong compared to later decades, was under strain. Television had become the dominant medium of mass communication. Events were no longer described after the fact. They were broadcast live. War entered living rooms. Political speeches reached millions instantly. The moon landing would become the most watched broadcast in history at that time. This convergence, Cold War rivalry, technological competition, domestic unrest, and the rise of live television created a unique environment. Success would mean prestige. Failure would mean humiliation. The United States had publicly promised victory. Behind the scenes, the scale of the Apollo program was unprecedented. More than 400,000 people contributed. Private aerospace contractors worked alongside government agencies. Enormous sums of taxpayer money were invested. The program was not only scientific, it was symbolic capital, and symbolism carries pressure. In 1967, the Apollo 1 capsule caught fire during a launch rehearsal. 3 astronauts died. The tragedy exposed technical flaws and intensified scrutiny. NASA paused, investigated, redesigned. The deadline Kennedy had set remained unchanged. The moon landing, if achieved, would need to demonstrate technological supremacy in full view of the world. By July 1969, Apollo 11 was prepared for launch. The Saturn V rocket stood over 360 feet tall. The command module, service module, and lunar module were stacked precisely. Every calculation depended on thousands of components functioning in exact coordination. On July 16th, the rocket ignited and lifted from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Millions watched the plume rise into the sky. 4 days later, the lunar module named Eagle separated and descended toward the moon's surface. At 2017 UTC on July 20th, Mission Control received confirmation. The Eagle has landed. Hours later, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. The images were grainy, high contrast, almost abstract. The surface appeared gray and barren. The American flag was planted. Experiments were deployed. Photographs were taken. Lunar samples were collected. For many, it was a moment of unity. Even rival nations broadcast the landing. In the Soviet Union, the event was reported. Humanity, it seemed, had taken a collective step. But the landing also unfolded under conditions that would later invite suspicion. Communication from the moon passed through government-controlled transmission networks. The original footage quality was limited by bandwidth. Independent verification in real time was impossible for the average citizen. The event depended on trust. Trust in engineers, trust in institutions, trust in the chain of custody for physical evidence. During the Cold War, secrecy was normal. Military and aerospace technologies were classified routinely. Details about rockets, guidance systems, and telemetry were not openly shared with adversaries. This secrecy was strategic. It also meant that much of what the public saw was filtered, summarized, and curated. At the time, most Americans accepted the achievement with pride. Opinion polls showed overwhelming belief in the success of the mission. Doubt existed, but it was marginal and quiet. Still, several conditions were present that would later fuel alternative interpretations. First, the scale of national investment created high stakes. Failure would have carried political consequences. Second, the geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union meant that prestige was intertwined with propaganda. Third, the technology itself was beyond the comprehension of most citizens. Rocket propulsion, orbital mechanics, and radiation shielding were abstract concepts to the average viewer. Fourth, media was centralized. 3 major television networks controlled what millions saw simultaneously. Finally, the 1960s ended with a collapse in public trust. Within a few years of the landing, the Watergate scandal would expose executive misconduct. The Pentagon Papers would reveal government deception regarding Vietnam. Institutions once assumed transparent would be questioned openly. The moon landing sat between 2 eras, one of relative institutional confidence and one of widespread skepticism. That timing matters. Because when later generations revisited the footage, the flag appearing to ripple, the stark shadows, the absence of visible stars, they did so in a different cultural climate than the one in which it was first broadcast. In 1969, the achievement answered a question. Could humans reach the moon? Decades later, another question emerged. Should we trust that they did? The moon landing became more than an event. It became a symbol of triumph for some, of doubt for others. Before examining the theories that would grow in the years to come, the official account must be understood clearly and fully. The timeline, the documentation, The physical evidence and the institutional responses form the foundation upon which all subsequent debate rests. Only by grounding the story in its historical context can the later skepticism be examined with clarity. Because whether viewed as achievement or illusion, the moon landing remains one of the most consequential moments of the 20th century. A moment suspended between certainty and suspicion, between technological possibility and human doubt. The official narrative. To understand why the moon landing remains defended as one of the most thoroughly documented achievements in history, the official account must be laid out in full, chronologically, technically, and institutionally. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969, at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time from Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The vehicle was the Saturn V, a 3-stage liquid-fueled rocket standing 363 feet tall. At liftoff, it generated approximately 7.6 million pounds of thrust. The first stage burned for roughly 2.5 minutes before separating. The second and third stages ignited sequentially, propelling the spacecraft into Earth orbit. The spacecraft itself consisted of 3 primary components: the command module Columbia, which would house the crew during launch and re-entry, the service module, containing propulsion and life support systems, and the lunar module Eagle, designed specifically for descent to and ascent from the moon's surface. After achieving Earth orbit, the third stage reignited to initiate translunar injection, the maneuver that placed the spacecraft on a trajectory toward the moon. Once en route, the command module separated, rotated, and docked with the lunar module, which had been housed within the rocket's upper stage. The combined spacecraft then continued its 3-day journey across approximately 240,000 miles of space. Throughout this transit, NASA maintained continuous communication via the Deep Space Network, a global system of tracking stations located in California, Spain, and Australia. Signals transmitted from the spacecraft were received, amplified, and relayed worldwide. Telemetry data included speed, trajectory, oxygen levels, cabin pressure, and dozens of other parameters. These transmissions were not confined to NASA alone. International observatories and amateur radio operators reported detecting Apollo's signals independently. On July 19th, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit. A precisely timed engine burn slowed the spacecraft sufficiently to be captured by the moon's gravitational pull. The crew circled the moon while preparing for descent. On July 20th, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin transferred into the lunar module Eagle. Michael Collins remained in the command module Columbia, orbiting alone. The lunar module separated and began powered descent toward the surface. The descent was not entirely smooth. Computer alarms triggered unexpectedly due to data overflow conditions, later attributed to radar processing overload. Mission Control in Houston evaluated the alarms in real time and determined that descent could continue safely. As Eagle approached the surface, Armstrong manually adjusted the landing site to avoid a rocky area. With approximately 30 seconds of fuel remaining, the lunar module touched down in the Sea of Tranquility. "The Eagle has landed," Armstrong reported. Several hours later, Armstrong descended the ladder and stepped onto the lunar surface. Aldrin joined him shortly after. For approximately 2.5 hours, the 2 astronauts conducted extravehicular activities. The activities included deploying scientific instruments, collecting rock and soil samples, photographing the terrain, and planting the American flag. They placed a plaque on the lunar module's descent stage bearing the inscription, "We came in peace for all mankind." Among the equipment deployed were a passive seismic experiment package to measure moonquakes and a laser-ranging retroreflector, a device designed to reflect laser beams sent from Earth. That retroreflector remains in use today. Observatories around the world still direct lasers at it to measure the precise distance between Earth and the Moon. In total, Apollo 11 astronauts collected approximately 21.5 kilograms of lunar material during their mission. Across 6 Apollo missions that landed between 1969 and 1972, 382 kilograms of lunar rock and soil were returned to Earth. After completing their surface activities, Armstrong and Aldrin re-entered the lunar module and rested. The ascent stage ignited on July 21st, lifting off from the Moon and leaving the descent stage behind. The ascent module rendezvoused and docked with Columbia in lunar orbit. The crew transferred samples and equipment, then jettisoned the lunar module. Apollo 11 departed lunar orbit and began its return to Earth. On July 24th, the command module re-entered Earth's atmosphere at approximately 25,000 miles per hour. A heat shield protected the capsule as temperatures outside reached thousands of degrees. Parachutes deployed successfully, and the spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The crew was recovered by the USS Hornet and initially placed in quarantine as a precaution against potential lunar pathogens. This timeline, from launch to splashdown, is supported by thousands of pages of mission transcripts, engineering reports, and flight data logs. NASA archived telemetry data, audio recordings, and photographic material extensively. The mission was not a singular event, but part of a broader program involving multiple test flights and subsequent lunar landings. Scientific evidence presented. The lunar samples returned from Apollo missions have been analyzed by laboratories worldwide. Geological examination revealed characteristics distinct from Earth rocks, absence of water alteration, specific isotopic compositions, and evidence of prolonged exposure to solar wind. Over decades, samples have been shared with researchers in multiple countries, including those that were not US allies. The retroreflectors placed during Apollo missions continue to function. Laser ranging experiments measure the Earth-Moon distance with centimeter precision. These measurements confirm orbital models and have been replicated independently by scientific institutions outside the United States. Seismic instruments deployed on the lunar surface transmitted data back to Earth for years. These readings contributed to understanding the Moon's internal structure. Independent tracking and verification. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union tracked Apollo missions using its own monitoring systems. The Soviets possessed radar and radio equipment capable of detecting spacecraft trajectories. At no point did the Soviet government formally challenge the authenticity of the moon landing. Instead, Soviet media reported the landing as a legitimate American achievement. Observatories in Australia and Spain, part of NASA's Deep Space Network, received signals directly from Apollo 11. Amateur radio operators reported intercepting transmissions. Although NASA coordinated primary communications, the signals themselves traveled through open space and could be detected by appropriately equipped receivers. Institutional oversight. NASA operated under congressional oversight. Budget allocations, mission reports, and technical documentation were reviewed by committees. Following the Apollo 1 fire, NASA underwent intense investigation and redesign before resuming manned missions. Post-mission documentation included the Apollo 11 mission report, spanning hundreds of pages. Declassified transcripts detail conversations between astronauts and mission control. Photographic archives contain thousands of images taken on the lunar surface and in orbit. In subsequent decades, high-resolution images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, launched in 2009, photographed the Apollo landing sites. These images showed descent stages, rover tracks from later missions, and disturbed lunar soil consistent with astronaut activity. Expert position. Aerospace engineers, physicists, planetary geologists, and astronauts consistently affirm the feasibility and success of the Apollo missions. Calculations regarding radiation exposure through the Van Allen belts indicate that given the spacecraft's trajectory and transit speed, doses were within survivable limits. Thermal modeling addresses temperature extremes. Photographic analysis explains lighting conditions in the absence of atmospheric scattering. Across more than 5 decades, no verified documentation has emerged from NASA or its contractors indicating fabrication of the landing. The Apollo program involved an estimated 400,000 individuals. Maintaining a coordinated deception across that scale would require sustained silence from engineers, administrators, contractors, international observers, and foreign intelligence agencies. Internal consistency. The official account aligns across multiple domains. Telemetry logs correspond with mission timing and astronaut dialogue. Geological findings match lunar origin characteristics. Laser ranging experiments produce consistent measurements. Independent international monitoring confirms spacecraft trajectory. Subsequent missions replicated similar flight profiles. The Apollo program did not conclude with Apollo 11. 5 additional missions landed astronauts on the Moon between 1969 and 1972. These missions expanded scientific experiments, deployed rovers, and returned further samples. No institutional retraction or formal acknowledgement of fabrication has ever been issued by NASA, the US government, or foreign monitoring agencies. The official narrative, therefore, presents a comprehensive framework, a defined timeline, technical explanation, physical evidence, independent tracking, scientific validation, and sustained international acknowledgement. It stands not as a single televised moment, but as a complex program spanning years of development, testing, oversight, and documentation. Understanding this framework is essential before turning to the alternative explanations that would begin emerging more prominently in the years that followed. Because skepticism did not arise in a vacuum, it arose in conversation with this official account, responding to its images, its data, and the institutions that delivered it. First wave of conspiracy theories. The first doubts did not arrive decades later through viral videos or social media threads. They began quietly, almost immediately after the broadcast faded. In 1969 and 1970, a small number of letters appeared in local newspapers, questioning whether the moon landing had truly occurred as described. These early objections were not yet organized into a coherent theory. They were fragments of skepticism. Some questioned the clarity of the footage. Others wondered whether the technology was simply too advanced to be credible. A few suggested that the Cold War created motives for exaggeration. At the time, these doubts remained marginal. Public opinion polling through the early 1970s showed overwhelming belief that the landing had occurred. But the seeds had been planted. The first sustained, structured challenge to the official account emerged in the mid-1970s. In 1974, a former Rocketdyne technical writer named Bill Kaysing self-published a book titled "We Never Went to the Moon: America's $30 Billion Swindle." Kaysing had worked for a company that manufactured engines used in the Apollo program, though he was not directly involved in mission design or execution. In his book, he argued that NASA lacked the technological capability in the 1960s to land humans safely on the moon and return them. Kaysing's claims centered on feasibility. He questioned whether the Saturn V rocket could deliver sufficient thrust reliably. He argued that the Van Allen radiation belts would have exposed astronauts to lethal doses. He suggested that guidance systems were too primitive for precision landing. He asserted that the United States, facing Cold War pressure and political deadlines, chose to simulate success rather than risk public failure. Kaysing proposed that the landing was staged in a remote desert environment, possibly in Nevada. He argued that the broadcast footage could have been filmed on Earth and transmitted as if live. His writing did not rely heavily on photographic analysis yet. Instead, it leaned on institutional mistrust and perceived technical impossibility. The mid-1970s provided fertile ground for such arguments. The Vietnam War had eroded public trust in official statements. The Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, revealed that government officials had misled the public about the scope and progress of the conflict. In 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned amid the Watergate scandal, confirming that high-level deception had occurred within the executive branch. These revelations reshaped public perception. If the government had concealed information about war and political misconduct, some reasoned, could it also have misrepresented technological achievement? The moon landing, once a symbol of national unity, began to be re-examined under a more skeptical lens. By the late 1970s, alternative claims expanded beyond technical feasibility into visual anomalies. Some viewers pointed to the American flag planted on the lunar surface. In broadcast footage and photographs, the flag appeared to ripple or wave slightly. On the moon, there is no atmosphere. Without air, how could fabric move? Others observed that stars were not visible in lunar surface photographs. The moon has no atmospheric scattering to obscure distant stars. Why did the sky appear uniformly black? Shadow patterns also drew attention. In certain images, shadows appeared to diverge rather than run parallel. Critics suggested that multiple light sources were present, as in a film studio. These visual questions began circulating in lectures, pamphlets, and small gatherings. They were not yet mainstream, but they had begun to form a recognizable pattern. The argument evolved from "it was technically impossible" to "the images look staged." It is important to note that during this early phase, organized communities of believers were still relatively small. There was no internet infrastructure to amplify claims rapidly. Dissemination occurred through print, word of mouth, and occasional radio appearances. Nonetheless, cultural currents amplified receptivity. The 1970s saw the rise of investigative journalism and a broader questioning of authority. The counterculture movement encouraged skepticism toward institutions, corporations, and military power. Scientific literacy among the general public remained limited, meaning that complex technical rebuttals were not easily accessible or digestible. The moon landing footage itself, because of its grainy quality and unusual lighting, felt unfamiliar. The lunar surface did not resemble Earth terrain. The absence of atmosphere created stark contrasts. The astronauts' movements appeared slow and unnatural to some viewers. Without widespread access to detailed explanations of exposure settings, vacuum physics, or orbital mechanics, certain visual elements became open to interpretation. Another early claim involved the apparent lack of a blast crater beneath the lunar module. The descent engine had slowed the module during landing. Critics argued that a rocket powerful enough to lift off from the moon should have produced a visible crater or a significant dust displacement. Similarly, some questioned why the lunar module's landing pads appeared undamaged by intense heat. These arguments circulated in magazines and at public lectures. Some were featured in niche publications focused on UFOs or unexplained phenomena. The moon landing began to be folded into a broader landscape of suspicion that included questions about intelligence agencies, covert operations, and hidden technologies. Yet during this first wave, the theories remained relatively contained. Mainstream media occasionally addressed the claims, often briefly. NASA representatives dismissed the allegations as misunderstandings of physics and photography. Public interest fluctuated. By the end of the 1970s, surveys indicated that belief in a hoax remained a minority position. But it had grown from negligible to measurable. The first wave of conspiracy theories established core themes that would persist. Technical impossibility under 1960s constraints. Visual anomalies interpreted as staging evidence. Cold War political motive for deception. Institutional distrust rooted in contemporaneous scandals. These foundational arguments were not yet reinforced by viral documentaries or online forums. They spread slowly, person to person, publication to publication. It is also significant that this early skepticism did not typically claim that all Apollo missions were fabricated. Some early theorists focused specifically on Apollo 11. Others suggested that perhaps one or two missions were staged while others were genuine. The narrative was not yet fully consolidated. In this period, skepticism was exploratory. It asked, could the United States have risked national humiliation if the mission failed? Could technological pride have overridden transparency? Could a televised event have been engineered for symbolic victory? These questions were framed against the backdrop of a decade in which the public had learned that official narratives could be incomplete. Importantly, the Soviet Union did not publicly dispute the landing. For critics, this fact produced two interpretations. Some argued that Soviet silence confirmed authenticity. Others speculated that geopolitical detente, or mutual interest in preserving global stability, could explain non-confrontation. The absence of overt Soviet objection became part of the conversation rather than its conclusion. By the close of the 1970s, the Moon Landing Hoax Theory existed as a defined but fringe movement. It had identifiable proponents, a small but growing audience, and a set of recurring claims. What it did not yet have was amplification. The next decades, particularly with the rise of television specials and eventually the internet, would transform these early doubts into a far more visible cultural phenomenon. But the foundation had already been laid. The first wave established the emotional logic. If trust in institutions can falter in one domain, perhaps it can falter in others. The moon landing, once a singular moment of unity, had entered a new phase, not as a resolved event, but as a contested symbol, and that contest would expand. Evidence and patterns cited by supporters. By the time the Moon Landing Hoax Theory entered the 1980s and 1990s, its foundation had already been established. The early claims about technological impossibility and Cold War motive remained central, but the focus increasingly shifted toward patterns, especially visual, archival, and symbolic details that supporters believed were too unusual to ignore. This phase was not about proposing the theory for the first time. It was about reinforcing it. Supporters began pointing to specific anomalies in photographs, broadcast footage, documentation practices, and historical timing. These details were presented not as isolated mistakes, but as interconnected pieces of a larger narrative. Visual anomalies, the American flag. One of the most frequently cited elements is the American flag planted by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. In video footage and still images, the flag appears to ripple slightly. On Earth, fabric movement is caused by wind interacting with air molecules. The moon has no atmosphere. Supporters argue that this apparent motion suggests the presence of air, and therefore a staged environment. The official explanation states that the flag was attached to a horizontal rod to keep it extended. During installation, astronauts rotated and twisted the pole, which caused the fabric to oscillate. In a vacuum, without air resistance, such oscillations would persist longer than they would on Earth. Within the conspiracy framework, however, the movement is presented as visual evidence of Earth-based filming. The absence of stars. Another commonly cited anomaly is the lack of visible stars in lunar surface photographs. The moon has no atmospheric scattering, meaning stars should theoretically appear sharp and bright against a black sky. Supporters argue that the absence of stars suggests a studio backdrop or exposure manipulation. The official explanation attributes this to camera exposure settings. The lunar surface is brightly illuminated by direct sunlight. To properly expose astronauts and terrain, camera settings were adjusted to relatively fast shutter speeds and small apertures. Under such settings, distant stars would not register on film. For believers, however, the stark black background becomes symbolic, interpreted as emptiness rather than distance. Shadow divergence. In several photographs, shadows cast by astronauts and equipment appear to diverge slightly rather than run perfectly parallel. Supporters argue that parallel sunlight rays should produce parallel shadows. Diverging shadows suggest multiple light sources, similar to studio lighting. Photographic and terrain experts counter that uneven lunar surface topography can cause apparent divergence. Perspective distortion can also make parallel lines appear to converge or diverge depending on camera angle. Still, the visual impression remains persuasive for some viewers unfamiliar with geometric optics. Crosshair anomalies. Apollo cameras used riso plates, glass plates etched with crosshairs, to allow measurement and scaling. In some lunar photographs, objects appear to overlap or obscure portions of these crosshairs. Supporters interpret this as evidence that images were altered or composited after development. NASA's explanation states that high-contrast bright objects can cause photographic blooming, making them appear to extend slightly beyond their actual boundaries and partially obscure thin black lines beneath. Within conspiracy narratives, these details are presented as subtle signs of manipulation. Technical impossibility arguments. Van Allen radiation belts. The Earth is surrounded by zones of charged particles known as the Van Allen radiation belts. Supporters argue that astronauts traveling through these belts would have received lethal doses of radiation. Official data indicates that Apollo missions passed through the belts quickly and along trajectories minimizing exposure. Recorded dosimeter readings from astronauts reportedly show exposure levels comparable to certain medical imaging procedures. Believers, however, question the accuracy or authenticity of those readings. Temperature extremes. The lunar surface experiences dramatic temperature swings, from extreme heat in direct sunlight to intense cold in shadow. Supporters question whether the lunar suits and modules of the 1960s were sufficiently advanced to protect astronauts. NASA documentation describes multi-layered suits with reflective outer coatings and life support systems regulating internal temperature. For supporters, the perceived fragility of 1960s technology contrasts with the harshness of the environment. Blast crater debate. Photographs show the lunar module resting on relatively undisturbed surface soil without a large crater beneath it. Supporters argue that the descent engine's thrust should have displaced more dust and created visible excavation. NASA explains that the engine was throttled down during final descent and that lunar soil compaction differs from loose Earth sand. Additionally, no atmosphere means no lateral blast dispersion. In conspiracy discussions, this detail is often presented alongside the absence of scorched landing pads. Archival and documentation questions. Missing original tapes. One of the most significant documented archival issues involves the original Apollo 11 telemetry and broadcast tapes. In the early 2000s, NASA acknowledged that certain original slow-scan television tapes were erased or recorded over during routine data reuse in the 1970s. This fact is verified. NASA confirmed that storage limitations and tape recycling policies contributed to the loss. For supporters, this becomes a central anomaly. Why would original historic footage be overwritten? Why was preservation not prioritized? NASA maintains that at the time, the significance of archival storage was weighed against operational constraints and limited resources. In conspiracy discussions, however, the missing tapes are interpreted as removal of primary evidence. Delayed public access. Some supporters point to the delayed release of certain mission transcripts and raw data as evidence of opacity. It is true that portions of documentation were declassified or digitized years later. Government agencies often release materials in stages. Believers argue that delayed transparency fuels suspicion. Stanley Kubrick connection. A recurring symbolic pattern involves film director Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick's 1968 film, 2001. A Space Odyssey featured realistic depictions of space travel released 1 year before Apollo 11. Supporters speculate that Kubrick's visual effects expertise could have been used to stage lunar footage. Some cite alleged coded messages within his later film, The Shining, as confessions. There is verified evidence that Kubrick consulted with NASA engineers for technical realism in his film. There is no verified evidence that he collaborated with NASA to stage the moon landing. Within conspiracy circles, however, timing and cinematic realism are interpreted symbolically rather than evidentially. Categorization of claims. Verified facts. NASA acknowledged erasing certain original Apollo 11 broadcast tapes. Stanley Kubrick consulted aerospace experts while making 2001. Cold War political pressure was significant. Government secrecy was common in defense-related programs. Disputed claims. Assertions that radiation exposure would have been fatal. Claims of photographic compositing or image manipulation. Allegations of staged desert filming. Speculation. Coordinated psychological operation to intimidate the Soviet Union. Hollywood government collaboration to fabricate footage. Institutional cover-up maintained across decades. Media and omission patterns. Supporters often argue that mainstream media avoids detailed discussion of anomalies. They interpret brief dismissals as evidence of narrative protection rather than resolution. They also point to the limited number of independent journalists physically present during mission operations. Access to launch sites and mission control was controlled. This controlled access, though typical for sensitive programs, is presented as another pattern of centralized narrative management. Coincidence framing. Conspiracy narratives often highlight clusters of perceived coincidences: political deadline pressure, Cold War rivalry, institutional secrecy culture, missing archival materials, visual anomalies in footage. Individually, each element may have an explanation. Together, supporters argue, they form a pattern. In this framework, the moon landing becomes not just a question of physics, but of power and narrative control. The role of interpretation. Importantly, many of the anomalies cited depend heavily on interpretation rather than hidden documentation. A shadow angle becomes a studio light. A moving flag becomes wind. A black sky becomes absence rather than exposure. An erased tape becomes destruction rather than storage policy. Supporters emphasize that doubt does not require definitive proof of staging, only enough unresolved anomalies to justify suspicion. And because most viewers lack technical expertise in orbital mechanics, vacuum physics, or film exposure, visual interpretation becomes the dominant tool of analysis. This is why the debate persists visually rather than technically. The images are accessible, the equations are not. By the end of this phase, the hoax theory was no longer a single argument about feasibility. It had become a collection of visual cues, archival questions, symbolic associations, and institutional distrust. These patterns would later be amplified by television specials and eventually by the internet, where side-by-side image comparisons and slow-motion replays could circulate widely. But even before amplification, the narrative architecture was complete. For supporters, the moon landing was not disproven through one decisive revelation. It was rendered suspect through accumulation, anomaly layered upon anomaly. And in that accumulation, belief found reinforcement. The next stage would not be about discovering new anomalies. It would be about magnifying them, reshaping public perception through repetition, accessibility, and digital reach. The theory had moved from fringe pamphlets to visual argument, and it was preparing to enter the mainstream conversation. Evolution, amplification, and counter-analysis. By the 1980s, the moon landing hoax theory had moved beyond isolated pamphlets and small lecture circuits. It had accumulated a recognizable structure: visual anomalies, Cold War motive, archival irregularities. What changed in the decades that followed was not necessarily the content of the claims, but their reach. The theory evolved in response to media technology itself, from fully fake to partially staged. Early claims often suggested that Apollo 11 never traveled to the moon at all. As more technical rebuttals became widely available, the narrative shifted in some circles. Rather than claiming the entire mission was fabricated, newer variations proposed hybrid explanations. Some argued that astronauts may have traveled to space, but the televised footage was staged in advance as a backup in case of failure. Others suggested that certain segments of the broadcast were enhanced or recreated later for clarity. A smaller subset proposed that unmanned probes reached the moon, but humans did not. This evolution reflects a pattern seen in many long-standing conspiracy movements. When a claim encounters counter-evidence, it often adapts rather than disappears. Television amplification. A major turning point occurred in 2001 when a primetime television special aired titled Conspiracy Theory. Did we land on the moon? The program presented many of the now familiar photographic anomalies: flag movement, missing stars, shadow divergence, in a polished format accessible to millions. The special featured interviews with supporters of the hoax theory, slow-motion footage, and side-by-side comparisons. Although NASA scientists and independent experts were interviewed in response segments, many viewers later reported remembering the questions more vividly than the rebuttals. The broadcast marked a shift. What had once circulated in niche communities now entered mainstream households in documentary format. NASA responded publicly, publishing detailed explanations addressing each visual anomaly. Engineers and physicists participated in interviews and public forums. But in the emerging media environment, rebuttals competed with repetition. The Internet era. The rise of the Internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s transformed the scale of amplification. Message boards allowed believers to share frame-by-frame analyses of lunar photographs. Amateur video editors uploaded slowed-down clips, highlighting perceived inconsistencies. Forums dedicated to alternative explanations accumulated thousands of members. In earlier decades, access to mission data required specialized archives. Online, selected images and excerpts could be shared instantly, often without surrounding context. YouTube, launched in 2005, became a particularly powerful amplifier. Short, visually striking videos questioning the moon landing reached audiences who may never have encountered the theory through books or lectures. Algorithms favor engagement. Content that evokes surprise or suspicion often performs strongly. As a result, videos questioning Apollo frequently circulated widely. This amplification altered public perception. Surveys in the 1990s and 2000s showed that a measurable minority, sometimes between 5% and 10% in certain polls, expressed doubt that humans had landed on the moon. The number remained small relative to the majority, but it was persistent. Influencers and viral moments. Podcast hosts, independent filmmakers, and online commentators revisited the theory repeatedly. Some approached it skeptically. Others framed it as unresolved mystery. High-profile confrontations between conspiracy advocates and former astronauts occasionally went viral. In one widely circulated incident, Buzz Aldrin was confronted by a man accusing him of faking the landing. The exchange became emblematic of how emotionally charged the debate had become. Documentaries continued to revisit the topic periodically, especially during anniversaries of the landing. Each resurgence introduced the theory to a new generation. Cultural context. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw several confirmed cases of government misconduct, from intelligence controversies to surveillance disclosures. For some individuals, these revelations reinforced a broader belief that institutions are capable of deception on large scales. In that environment, the moon landing became part of a larger conversation about trust. It also became symbolic. Believing the landing was faked often functioned less as a statement about 1969 physics, and more as a statement about skepticism toward centralized authority. Counter-analysis and expert response. As amplification increased, so did organized counter-analysis. Physicists and engineers produced detailed explanations of shadow geometry, radiation exposure, and photographic exposure settings. Educational institutions published breakdowns of the flag movement phenomenon, demonstrating how oscillation behaves in a vacuum. Radiation exposure through the Van Allen belts was recalculated publicly. Simulations showed that the trajectory used by Apollo minimized time spent in the highest radiation zones. Dosimeter readings recorded during missions were analyzed and compared to known safety thresholds. High-resolution imagery from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, launched in 2009, provided photographs of Apollo landing sites. These images showed descent stages, equipment, and even the paths of astronaut foot traffic from later missions. International agencies also contributed indirectly. China's Chang'e lunar missions and India's Chandrayaan orbiters mapped the moon extensively. Although not launched specifically to verify Apollo sites, their mapping data aligns with known landing coordinates. Geologists continued analyzing lunar samples, noting isotopic ratios distinct from terrestrial rock. Samples were distributed globally over decades, making large-scale fabrication increasingly complex. Logical inconsistencies. Highlighted. Counter-analysts often point to scale. The Apollo program involved an estimated 400,000 workers and contractors. Maintaining a coordinated deception across that number for decades would require silence not only from NASA employees, but from subcontractors, international observers, and foreign intelligence agencies. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union tracked Apollo missions. Critics of the hoax theory argue that exposing a fabrication would have been strategically advantageous to the Soviets. No such exposure occurred. Supporters of the hoax theory respond by suggesting geopolitical incentives for mutual silence or shared reputational preservation. In this exchange, each side interprets the same historical facts differently. Why belief persists? Despite decades of technical rebuttals, belief in the hoax theory has not vanished. Several psychological and sociological factors are often cited. Complexity gap. The technical details of orbital mechanics and vacuum physics are difficult for non-specialists to evaluate. Visual anomalies are easier to interpret than mathematical equations. Narrative appeal. The idea of uncovering a hidden truth can feel empowering. It offers a sense of insight beyond official narratives. Institutional distrust. Confirmed instances of government deception in other contexts create a framework where additional skepticism feels reasonable. Algorithmic reinforcement. Online platforms tend to recommend similar content to what users already engage with, reinforcing pre-existing beliefs. Generational distance. Younger generations did not experience the landing live. For them, the event exists only through archived footage. Without personal memory anchoring the event, it may feel less tangible. Shifts in public perception. Polling data over decades shows fluctuations. At times of heightened institutional mistrust, doubt percentages increase slightly. During the major anniversaries with renewed scientific celebration, confidence tends to rise. The debate itself has become part of cultural memory. Films, television shows, and parodies reference the hoax theory regularly. The notion that some people think it was fake has become almost as familiar as the landing itself. This normalization means that even individuals who do not fully endorse the theory may treat it as an open question rather than settled history. Tension between evidence and interpretation. At its core, the ongoing debate illustrates a tension between evidence accumulation and interpretive framing. For supporters of the official narrative, the cumulative weight of telemetry, rock samples, independent tracking, and subsequent lunar missions forms a coherent structure. For supporters of the hoax theory, anomalies, archival irregularities, and institutional mistrust form a competing structure. The same images and historical facts are filtered through different assumptions about authority, capability, and motive. By the 21st century, the Moon Landing Hoax Theory had transitioned from fringe speculation to recurring cultural reference. It appears in online debates, documentaries, classrooms, and casual conversations. It no longer depends on a single book or pamphlet. It circulates through digital ecosystems that reward repetition. And as long as new generations encounter the footage without having witnessed the event firsthand, the conversation is likely to continue. The question has evolved. It is no longer only, did humans land on the moon? It is also, how do societies decide what counts as proof? The final part of this documentary will step back from the technical and historical details to examine that broader question: the psychological, cultural, and institutional forces that allow doubt to endure, even in the presence of extensive documentation. Impact and uncertainty. More than half a century after Apollo 11 touched down in the Sea of Tranquility, the moon landing occupies a rare position in cultural memory. It is at once a scientific milestone, a geopolitical triumph, and a recurring point of doubt. It lives simultaneously as documented achievement and as subject of suspicion. That dual existence is part of what gives the story its endurance. The psychological dimension. Human beings are pattern-seeking by nature. We look for coherence in scattered details. When something appears inconsistent, a shadow angle, a missing tape, a ripple in fabric, it draws attention. In complex events, small irregularities can take on symbolic weight. The moon landing was not a simple event. It involved advanced mathematics, extreme environments, global politics, and live broadcast technology. For most viewers in 1969, and for most viewers today, the technical underpinnings are difficult to evaluate independently. That gap between experience and expertise creates space for interpretation. In that space, two instincts can operate at once: trust and skepticism. Trust rests on institutional credibility, accumulated documentation, and scientific consensus. Skepticism rests on awareness that institutions have erred or misled before. When historical examples of deception become widely known, they can reshape how unrelated events are interpreted. For some individuals, believing the moon landing was staged is less about rejecting science and more about asserting independence from centralized authority. It becomes a declaration that narratives should not be accepted uncritically. This impulse is not new. It appears throughout history whenever power and information are concentrated. The cultural impact. The hoax theory has influenced popular culture in subtle and overt ways. Films and television series reference it casually. Comedians use it as shorthand for skepticism. Characters in dramas debate it as a marker of worldview. The very idea that some people believe it was fake has become normalized. It is no longer confined to fringe communities. It appears in classroom discussions, online comment sections, and casual conversation. This normalization shifts the focus from the landing itself to the nature of belief. The moon becomes less a destination and more a mirror, reflecting how societies negotiate evidence and authority. The theory has also intersected with broader movements of mistrust. During periods when public confidence in institutions declines, interest in historical controversies tends to increase. The moon landing is often revisited alongside other disputed narratives, not because the events are directly connected, but because they share a theme: institutional power. Media and algorithms. The digital age has reshaped how information circulates. Platforms reward engagement, and engagement is often driven by surprise or contradiction. A video claiming hidden truth may spread faster than a technical explanation. Algorithms learn user preferences. If a viewer watches content questioning the moon landing, they are more likely to be shown similar content. Over time, this reinforcement can create the impression of widespread consensus within a curated feed. This dynamic does not determine belief, but it influences exposure. The same technological systems that allow unprecedented access to archival documents also allow selective emphasis on anomalies. In this environment, repetition becomes powerful. A visual detail replayed thousands of times can feel more persuasive than a lengthy technical report rarely read. Open questions and archival gaps. Even within the official record, certain elements remain points of discussion. NASA acknowledged that original slow-scan television tapes from Apollo 11 were overwritten in the 1970s due to data storage practices at the time. While higher quality copies and converted broadcasts remain, the loss of original tapes continues to raise questions for some observers about preservation decisions. Archival transparency is an evolving process. Government agencies have gradually digitized and released large volumes of mission data. Yet the perception of incomplete access can persist, especially when documentation is technical and difficult to interpret without specialized knowledge. Conflicting testimony is rare, but occasionally cited. Offhand remarks by astronauts or engineers, when taken out of context, circulate as ambiguous statements. In a digital landscape, short excerpts can be amplified without surrounding explanation. These elements do not constitute proof of fabrication. They represent areas where documentation practices and public perception intersect imperfectly. The future of verification. Ironically, the debate may be influenced by future missions rather than past ones. Multiple space agencies, including NASA, China's CNSA, and private companies, are planning or conducting renewed lunar exploration. High-resolution imaging continues to improve. Human return missions are being prepared. If future astronauts land near Apollo sites and document preserved equipment directly, that imagery will enter the historical record as well. Whether such documentation would resolve skepticism entirely is uncertain. In long-standing debates, new evidence can be interpreted through existing frameworks rather than replacing them. Uncertainty as a feature of history. History is rarely experienced directly. It is reconstructed through records, artifacts, testimony, and interpretation. The moon landing, despite being broadcast live, still reaches most people through mediated archives. For those who watched in 1969, the memory is personal. For those born later, it is inherited. The persistence of doubt does not erase the extensive documentation supporting the landing. At the same time, the existence of doubt reveals something enduring about human inquiry. Skepticism can function as both critical thinking and reflexive distrust. The boundary between the two is often shaped by context. In examining the moon landing hoax theory, it becomes clear that the debate is not solely about rockets or shadows. It is about credibility, transparency, power, and the psychology of belief. Reflective closing. The moon still orbits Earth, indifferent to debate. On its surface, descent stages remain where they were left. Retroreflectors continue to return laser pulses. Archives continue to expand. Images continue to circulate. For some, the question was answered in 1969. For others, it remains open. The evidence is vast. The skepticism persists. And the conversation reflects more than a single event. It reflects how societies decide what to trust, what to question, and how to balance both. The theories discussed in this documentary are presented for informational and discussion purposes only. Allegations referenced are not asserted as fact. This exploration does not intend to defame, misrepresent, or accuse any individual, institution, or agency. Viewers are encouraged to consult primary sources, scientific documentation, and independent research when forming conclusions. Thank you for watching Whims and Whispers. If you found this exploration thoughtful, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue examining complex historical mysteries with a calm and investigative lens. Let us know in the comments which conspiracy or historical question you would like us to explore next. Until then, thank you for spending this time with us.